My friends, today I want to share with you a story, not of privilege or position, but of dignity, courage, and the unwavering belief that respect is owed to every human being. A man, a black CEO who had worked his entire life to rise above every barrier, boarded a flight one ordinary afternoon. He held a ticket for the first-class cabin, not given, not borrowed, but earned through years of sacrifice, discipline, relentless pursuit of excellence. And yet, when he arrived at his seat, he was denied. Not because of paperwork, not because of policy, but because of prejudice. A quiet moment of humiliation settled in the air. Passengers watched as if history itself was playing out before their eyes. For 25 long minutes, he sat in silence, a silence filled not with defeat, but with strength. In that silence lived every ancestor who marched, every worker who sacrificed, every child who still dreams of a world that is fair and just. And then something remarkable happened. A ripple of unease spread through the cabin. Whispers turned into questions. Questions turned into outrage. Outrage turned into unity. Passengers stood. A flight attendant apologized. The pilot stepped forward. And within moments, the airline itself was in chaos. Not because of one man's pain, but because a plane full of people remembered their conscience. This is not just a story about a flight. It is the story of America. The story of how ordinary men and women, strangers sitting side by side, can rise together when they see injustice. We are reminded that perseverance is not passive. Change is not distant. Belief in a better future is not abstract. It is lived in the choices we make, the voices we raise, and the courage we summon in the face of wrong. And so, I say to you, we are all passengers on this journey. Every seat matters. Every voice matters. Every act of courage matters. CEO's dignity did not just challenge an airline that day. It awakened the best within those around him. And it calls to us now to stand, to speak, to believe. Because a better world does not arrive by accident. It arrives when people, ordinary people, extraordinary in their conviction, choose to make it so. So let us rise. Let us persevere. Let us believe in that better future. And let us act together, knowing that justice delayed is never justice denied. Not if we refuse to give up. There is a truth that echoes through the history of every great struggle for justice. Dignity is never handed out like a gift. It is not a token offered by the powerful to the powerless. Dignity is earned, built piece by piece, day by day, through the sacrifices of those who refuse to bend in the face of adversity. It is the product of late nights and early mornings, of sweat on the brow and calluses on the hands, of disappointments endured and barriers overcome. The black CEO who stepped onto that plane did not stumble upon success by chance. His journey was not one of privilege but of perseverance. He was a man who had seen doors shut in his face, who had been told he did not belong in the boardroom, who had felt the sting of stereotypes weighing down expectations. And yet, he climbed. He studied harder, worked longer, and carried himself with the knowledge that he was not just building a life for himself, but paving a road for those who would come after him. Every promotion he earned, every company he built, every decision he made was a brick laid in the foundation of his dignity. His seat in first class was not a luxury, it was a symbol of long nights when the lights in his office burned while others slept. Symbol of the times he bit his tongue when underestimated, choosing patience over anger. A symbol of every ancestor who once could not sit at the front of a bus, who could not vote freely, who could not walk through the doors of opportunity without resistance. And yet, in a moment, that symbol was challenged. He was told he did not belong, not because of paperwork, not because of merit, but because of a prejudice older than the airline itself. In that instant, the injustice was not about a seat on a plane. It was about history daring to repeat itself. It was about society whispering once more that no matter how high a man might climb, some would still try to push him down. But here lies the deeper truth: dignity is not dependent on permission. No gatekeeper, no flight attendant, no policy, no prejudice has the authority to strip away what has been earned through sacrifice. Dignity is carried in the way a man holds his silence in the face of insult. It is present in the way he does not bow his head when asked to step aside, but instead keeps his posture steady, his eyes forward, his heart unshaken. For those watching, it may have seemed like an isolated confrontation, but for those who know the weight of history, It was a reminder that every battle for respect is fought on behalf of generations. The CEO's struggle in that cabin was not his alone. It was the echo of parents who worked 2 jobs so their children could study. It was the reflection of a grandmother who walked miles to clean houses she would never live in so her family might live better. It was the unspoken voice of a young boy told he could never lead, daring to prove the world wrong. When we speak of dignity earned, we speak not just of titles or positions, but of the character that sustains them. The world may question your worth. Institutions may deny your belonging. Strangers may doubt your right to be where you stand. But dignity does not waver with the opinions of others. It is an internal flame fed by sacrifice, guarded by integrity, and passed down like an inheritance from one generation to the next. The seat in first class was his not because of the price on the ticket, but because of the price he had paid throughout his life. It was a reward for the relentless pursuit of excellence in a world that tried to place limits on him. It was not charity, it was not a favor, it was justice manifested in a single boarding pass, and when that justice was challenged, his quiet strength became a declaration louder than any protest. Dignity is not given, dignity is earned. Strength is often misunderstood. Too many believe it is loud, visible, and forceful. They imagine clenched fists, raised voices, and storms of resistance. Yet the deepest strength, the kind that unsettles injustice and commands respect, is often quiet. It is found in the stillness of a man who refuses to break, in the calm of someone who carries centuries of struggle within their chest, and in the silence that speaks louder than words. Black CEO was denied his rightful seat. He did not respond with fury. He did not shout. He did not allow anger to consume him. He sat in stillness, a man wronged but unbroken, a man humiliated but not defeated. Was not a weakness. It was power. It was the power of restraint, of refusing to give those who doubted him the satisfaction of watching him fall into their stereotype. For 25 minutes, the air inside that cabin was thick with tension. Every second of his silence was a statement. His calm composure stood in stark contrast to the turbulence of injustice that surrounded him, and the passengers, watching closely, began to feel that weight. His silence became a mirror, forcing them to confront their own discomfort. It was a silence that asked, "What will you do when confronted with something wrong? Will you sit quietly, or will you rise?" Strength is not passive. It is deliberate. It is the choice to hold one's dignity when the world tries to strip it away. It is the art of speaking without words, of teaching without lectures, of commanding without force. This man's silence carried the voices of those who came before him. Voices that had been silenced by laws, by chains, by injustice, and yet endured across generations. His silence carried history, and history is never truly silent. Think of the marchers who walked with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., their feet striking the pavement in rhythm, not shouting vengeance, but carrying banners of peace. Think of Rosa Parks, who said more by refusing to give up her seat than by shouting at her oppressor. Silent strength has always been one of the most unyielding weapons of justice. It is the silence of endurance, of dignity, of a will too deep to be broken by a single act of prejudice. In that moment on the plane, the CEO was not just a man in a seat. He was a symbol of self-control in the face of provocation. He was a reminder that anger may burn fast, but quiet strength burns steady. His silence disarmed the hostility that confronted him, leaving no opening for his oppressors to twist his narrative. They could not accuse him of disruption. They could not claim he was unruly. They could not diminish his dignity. His silence protected him like armor. And yet, his silence was not empty. It was filled with unspoken words, filled with the weight of generations who had endured. It was the silence of a man who had fought his battles in boardrooms, who had proven himself in arenas where doubt surrounded him, who had risen higher than anyone believed he could. It was the silence of someone who had been told, "No," 1,000 times, and yet kept moving until he had turned those no's into a resounding yes. The passengers around him began to sense that weight. They saw that this was not a man defeated. They saw that his stillness was not submission but defiance, and it stirred something within them. Silent strength has that power. It unsettles the comfortable. It forces action. It inspires courage. Silent strength is not about shrinking away. It is about holding ground. It is about refusing to be moved by injustice. It is about letting the world know that you will not lose yourself, even when others try to erase you. In that cabin, his silence was louder than any argument, more commanding than any outburst, more unforgettable than any speech he could have given. Injustice has a way of revealing itself not only in grand arenas, but in the smallest of spaces. It can surface on a sidewalk, in a classroom, a dinner table, or even in the narrow aisle of an airplane. What happened in that first-class cabin was not just an isolated act of prejudice. It was a mirror reflecting the broader struggles of a society that still wrestles with the weight of inequality. When the black CEO was told he could not take his rightful seat, the act was more than personal. It was historical. It was social. It was a flash of clarity that exposed the fragile line between progress and regression. For those who watched, it was as if the veil had been lifted, and they could see with uncomfortable sharpness how injustice still lives among us, even in the most modern of settings. The mirror of injustice does not distort, it reveals. It forces people to see what they might otherwise ignore. In that airplane cabin, passengers who moments before were strangers sipping coffee and adjusting seatbelts suddenly found themselves confronted with a choice: remain silent and complicit or acknowledge the injustice unfolding before their eyes. The moment demanded a reckoning, not only for the airline but for everyone present. History teaches us that such mirrors are not new. Decades ago, counters in the South became mirrors when young men and women sat peacefully while being denied service. Buses became mirrors when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. Schools became mirrors when children were escorted by federal marshals just to receive the education promised to them by law. And here, on an ordinary flight, a seat in first class became another mirror, reminding us that progress is not yet complete. The passengers saw more than one man denied a seat. They saw the persistence of something larger. They saw how quickly dignity can be questioned. They saw how prejudice, though often disguised in polite words and practiced smiles, remains sharp enough to wound. That mirror did not flatter, it revealed the hard truth that inequality lingers in the systems we trust. For the CEO himself, the moment was not surprising. Those who have lived with injustice rarely need a mirror to recognize it. They know its shape, its sting, its quiet attempt to humiliate. But for many watching, the reflection was jarring. Passengers were unsettled not only by what was happening to him, but by what it revealed about themselves. Their willingness to sit quietly, their hesitation to intervene, their temptation to look away. That is the power of injustice. As a mirror, it reflects not only the victim, but the bystander. When society is confronted with such a reflection, it faces a test of conscience. Do we deny what the mirror shows, pretending the image is distorted? Do we blame the one who suffers, suggesting he must have done something to deserve it? Or do we accept what we see and let it awaken in us a sense of responsibility? Too often, the first response has been denial or deflection. Yet in that cabin, different began to stir. The passengers could not unsee what was happening. They could not look away from the unfairness standing before them. The mirror demanded recognition. The truth is, injustice is rarely comfortable to witness. It is unsettling. It convicts. It whispers questions we would rather avoid if we're me. Would anyone stand for me? If I remain silent, am I not part of the problem? These are the questions injustice forces us to face. And in that discomfort lies the beginning of change. The mirror of injustice is both cruel and necessary. It humiliates in the moment, but it also awakens the conscience of those who see it. It holds up an unflinching reflection of society's flaws, daring us to admit what we would rather deny. For the passengers on that plane, and for anyone who hears the story, the reflection becomes unavoidable. It asks each of us to decide what kind of people we are when confronted by the truth. Conscience is a quiet force, but once stirred, it spreads like ripples on water. What begins as a small disturbance in the heart of one person can soon awaken the hearts of many. On that airplane, when the black CEO was denied the seat he had rightfully earned, the injustice at first seemed contained to a single man. Yet injustice rarely stays contained. It has a way of spilling outward, touching everyone in its presence. Itself becomes impossible. At first, the passengers observed quietly. Some avoided eye contact, some pretended to stay focused on their newspapers or devices, and some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But as the minutes stretched on, as the CEO sat in calm dignity, the air became heavier. It was not the turbulence of the plane, but the turbulence of conscience. People began to whisper. The whispers became questions. The questions turned into unease. And unease turned into something stronger, the demand to act. This is how conscience works. It begins in solitude, but rarely stays there. One person's discomfort can awaken another's, until suddenly the silence of many is broken by the courage of a few. It is like a stone thrown into still waters. The first ripple is small, almost invisible, but each one expands, touching more and more until the surface is transformed. We have seen these ripples of conscience before. When one student sat down at a segregated lunch counter, others soon joined. When one marcher stepped onto the bridge in Selma, thousands followed. When one voice spoke against injustice, others found the courage to lift their own. Conscience, once awakened, is contagious. It refuses to allow people to remain neutral in the face of wrong. On that flight, the passengers were confronted with a choice. They could remain comfortable in their seats, sipping their drinks and pretending not to notice, or they could rise in defense of what was right. The silence of the CEO was powerful. So was the ripple effect on the conscience of others that created momentum. The flight attendant could no longer pretend that protocol justified the decision. The pilot could no longer ignore the tension spreading through the cabin. The airline itself could not shield itself from the truth that passengers had seen and would not forget. The ripple of conscience is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is subtle, a glance shared between two people who know something must be said. Sometimes it is a murmur that grows into a demand. Sometimes it is one hand raised in protest that inspires another until dozens are raised in solidarity. What matters is not the size of the first ripple, but the fact that it begins at all. In that cabin, the passengers' consciences did not allow them to remain bystanders. One spoke up. Another agreed. Then another leaned forward to challenge the injustice. The still air began to move with the current of unity. The ripples had spread. Soon the entire cabin was alive with a collective demand for accountability. Conscience does not need permission to act. It only needs recognition. Too often, people suppress the voice within them that whispers this is wrong. They bury it under excuses, under fear, under the comfort of inaction. But once one person listens, once one person dares to let that voice rise, it encourages others to do the same. It gives permission for courage to grow. The ripple of conscience is humanity's greatest corrective force. It does not erase what has happened, but it changes what will happen next. It transforms passive observers into active participants. It reminds every person present that morality is not a spectator's sport. It is lived in the choices we make when injustice passes before our eyes. What began with one man's dignity became the stirring of many. Of the CEO was the stone dropped into the still waters of that cabin, and the ripples touched every passenger who had a conscience to feel. The airline may not have expected it. The attendants may not have welcomed it. But once the ripples began, they could not be stopped. History has always been moved forward not only by kings, generals, or presidents, but by ordinary people who found extraordinary courage in the face of injustice. Time and again, the courage of everyday men and women has altered the course of events, reshaped communities, and awakened societies. Courage, after all, is not reserved for the powerful. It belongs to anyone who refuses to remain silent when wrong is done. On that flight, when the black CEO sat quietly in the strength of his dignity, it was not only his resolve that defined the moment. It was the response of ordinary passengers who found the courage to speak, to stand, and to question. They were not activists trained for confrontation. They were travelers on their way to business meetings, family reunions, and vacations. Yet in that moment, they became something greater, witnesses who refused to remain passive. Their courage was not born from preparation but from conscience. This is the nature of extraordinary courage. It does not ask permission. It does not wait for convenient circumstances. It rises when it is needed most, often in unexpected places. The passengers on that flight may never have imagined that they would be called to action inside the narrow walls of an airplane, but courage rarely announces its arrival in advance. It arrives suddenly, demanding that ordinary people rise to the occasion. Consider how often the great turning points of justice began with ordinary individuals. A seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama, Faye, who was tired after a day's work but more tired of surrendering her dignity, refused to give up her bus seat. A group of students, no older than teenagers, chose to sit at a lunch counter where they knew they would not be welcome. Workers in factories risked their livelihood by organizing for fair pay and safe conditions. In each case, these were not figures of wealth or privilege. They were ordinary people who, through courage, became extraordinary. On the airplane, courage revealed itself in small but powerful ways. A passenger leaned forward to ask the flight attendant why the seat could not be honored. Another passenger nodded in agreement, lending silent solidarity. A third speaking more forcefully, reminding the crew that fairness and policy should not bow to prejudice. Each act of courage built upon the other until the weight of silence could no longer hold. Extraordinary courage often grows through community. One voice may tremble, but when joined by another, it steadies. One act may falter, but when met with support, it becomes firm. Courage is contagious, and ordinary people draw strength from the courage they see in others. That is why movements swell. That is why change spreads. And that is why injustice struggles to survive in the presence of collective resolve. Courage is not without cost. For those passengers, there was a risk in speaking. Perhaps they worried about being removed from the flight, about being labeled disruptive, about facing consequences for interfering. Yet courage accepts that cost. It values justice more than comfort. It chooses principle over convenience. Extraordinary courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The power of ordinary people lies in their numbers, and in their conscience. They are the backbone of every community, the builders of every nation, the sustainers of every society. And when they summon courage, they remind us all that change does not depend solely on those in positions of authority. It depends on the willingness of ordinary individuals to rise in extraordinary moments. On that day in the cabin, ordinary passengers became extraordinary by refusing to look away. Their courage did not require speeches or grand gestures. It required only the simple but profound act of saying, "This is wrong." And in that act, they transformed from observers into participants in justice, proving once again that courage belongs to anyone who dares to claim it. Unity is not simply the absence of division. It is the presence of collective will, the moment when individuals put aside hesitation and stand together for a principle greater than themselves. Action without unity can falter, but unity joined with action becomes a force capable of bending even the most stubborn structures of power. On that flight, when the denial of a rightful seat turned into a test of conscience, unity began to take form. At first, there was only one man sitting quietly, embodying strength through restraint. Around him, passengers shifted uneasily, thus unsure whether to speak. Yet conscience, once awakened, seeks companions. What began as whispers grew into voices, and what began as discomfort grew into solidarity. In a matter of minutes, a group of strangers found themselves moving from silence to shared purpose. This transformation is the essence of unity in action. It is not born from long preparation or organized planning. It is born in the instant when people realize that what affects one affects all. The injustice directed at one man became a concern for every passenger who believed in fairness. The courage of a few sparked the courage of many. Soon their voices converged into a single demand for justice. Unity in action has always been the heartbeat of progress. When workers stood shoulder to shoulder on factory floors demanding safe conditions, it was unity that gave them strength. When citizens marched together in streets for civil rights, it was unity that gave their steps power. When nations joined hands across oceans to confront tyranny, it was unity that gave them victory. Injustice may single out an individual, but it is unity that ensures no one faces it alone. On the airplane, unity took shape in visible ways. Passengers leaned forward together, not just one or two, but several, their collective body language signaling that they would not ignore what was unfolding. Murmurs of dissent became clearer, with more voices adding weight to the call for fairness. The crew could no longer treat the matter as a private dispute. It had become a collective concern. That is what unity in action does. It transforms the powerless into the powerful, not by changing their titles, but by joining their voices. Unity requires courage, but also requires empathy. Each passenger who spoke up had no personal stake in the seat assignment. They could have stayed silent, reasoning that it was not their battle. Yet, unity in action rests on the recognition that injustice anywhere threatens justice everywhere. Allow one man to be mistreated would be to accept the possibility of mistreatment for all. Empathy bridged the gap between bystander and participant, reminding each person on that plane that silence would be complicity. There is a lesson in this. Unity does not erase individuality, it magnifies it. Each passenger brought their own strength to the moment, their own voice, their own decision to stand. When woven together, these individual choices created a fabric of collective resistance. No single person carried the weight alone. Instead, they carried it together, and in that togetherness was power. Unity in action is also disruptive. It unsettles the status quo. For the airline staff, what might have been dismissed as a routine enforcement of authority became something far greater. The unity of passengers created chaos for those who had relied on silence and compliance. Systems built on quiet acceptance often crumble when confronted by collective defiance. Unity, therefore, is not simply agreement, it is the act of standing together to demand change where change is needed. The power of unity lies not in its volume but in its harmony. Dozens of voices shouting different things create noise, but a chorus of voices calling for the same principle creates undeniable clarity. On that flight, the chorus was unmistakable. Respect the dignity that has been earned, honor the fairness that has been promised, and correct the injustice that has been exposed. The unity of ordinary passengers did not require them to know each other, share backgrounds, or agree on all things. It required only that they share in the conviction that what was happening before their eyes was wrong. In that conviction, they acted together, and their unity became the most powerful presence in the cabin. Protest is often imagined as loud and visible marches filling the streets, chants echoing through city blocks, banners raised high against the backdrop of history. And yet, some of the most powerful forms of protest are quieter, subtler, rooted not in noise but in endurance. Perseverance itself can be protested. To continue standing when others expect you to fall, to continue striving when obstacles rise again and again, to keep pressing forward when the world has told you to stop. This is protest in its purest form. When the black CEO was denied his seat, his response was not anger or confrontation. It was perseverance. He sat firmly, unyielding, embodying the quiet strength of someone who had endured far worse and refused to surrender. His very presence in that cabin, calm and immovable, became an act of defiance. He had earned that seat not by chance but by decades of persistence against barriers designed to hold him back. Denying him was more than a personal insult. It was an attempt to erase that journey. But his perseverance would not allow it. Perseverance as protest is deeply rooted in the history of justice movements. When marchers were beaten on bridges but returned the next day, that was perseverance as protest. When children faced fire hoses and dogs but continued walking to school, perseverance as protest. When generations of families worked fields, studied by candlelight, and built communities despite every barrier, that was perseverance as protest. It is the refusal to be broken by the weight of injustice, quiet insistence on existing and thriving even when the world tries to deny your place. On that plane, the CEO's perseverance spoke louder than any argument could. He had already persevered through the long road to success, the late nights building his career, the dismissals and rejections that others might not have faced, the constant need to prove himself in rooms where he was underestimated. His life had been a series of protests carried out through perseverance. This moment was only the latest test. To sit calmly, to refuse to yield to humiliation, was not just patience. It was the same endurance that had carried him from obscurity to leadership. The passengers saw this perseverance, even if they did not immediately recognize it. His silence was not passive, it was a message. It was a man saying without words, "I will not be moved from what I have earned. I will not let you rewrite my worth, not give you the satisfaction of seeing me undone." That is the essence of perseverance as protest, to remain standing, to remain unbroken, to let your very presence declare resistance. Perseverance demands a strength deeper than defiance. It can be fleeting, loud, but short-lived. Perseverance endures. It refuses to let the moment define the outcome. It waits out injustice, wearing it down with an unshakable resolve. This is why those who practice perseverance often outlast their oppressors. They understand that protest is not always a single act, but a way of living. Every person who has faced injustice knows that perseverance requires sacrifice. It means absorbing insults, enduring delays, facing rejection, and still choosing to press forward. It means holding your dignity when others try to strip it away. It means believing that the struggle is not in vain, even when victory feels distant. The CEO on that flight carried the weight of this sacrifice, but he carried it with grace. His calm was not the absence of pain, it was the decision not to let pain control him. What makes perseverance such a powerful form of protest is that it denies injustice its victory. Injustice thrives when people break, when they surrender, when they accept the roles forced upon them. Perseverance denies that satisfaction. It declares, I am still here. I am still standing. I am still worthy. Each act of endurance chips away at the structures of inequality, reminding those who enforce them that they cannot win against someone who refuses to quit. The power of perseverance lies not in a single moment, but in its accumulation. It builds over years, over decades, over generations. It becomes the story of a people who, despite being denied, continue to rise. On that flight, perseverance was not simply the CEO's response to humiliation. It was his lifetime's answer to every barrier he had ever faced. Change is often imagined as something distant, something that comes slowly, measured in decades or generations. We think of laws rewritten, institutions transformed, entire societies shifting course. And yet, every great change begins in moments. Brief, fragile, unexpected points in time where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, where a decision is made, a word is spoken, or a silence is broken. On that flight, when one man was denied his seat, it seemed to some like a small event, insignificant in the scale of the world. But change does not always announce itself with fanfare. It creeps in quietly, through moments that test the conscience of those who witness them. 25 minutes on a plane may seem like nothing in the span of history, but within that window, the seeds of change were planted. The passengers who saw injustice could never unsee it. Their reactions, their decisions, their voices, all became part of a moment that mattered. This is the way progress has always unfolded. Rosa Parks's refusal to move was not a long speech, legislative battle. It was a single moment on a single bus. The fall of the Berlin Wall began with one mistaken announcement, a simple moment that opened the floodgates of change. A lunch counter sit-in lasted minutes before arrests came, but those minutes sparked waves that shook the nation. The march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge began with footsteps, small and ordinary, but they became immortal. Moments matter because they reveal character. In the quiet spaces where no spotlight shines, where no history books yet record, individuals are tested. They may not know their choice will echo into something greater, but they feel the weight of conscience pressing on them, telling them that the moment is not as small as it seems. To stay silent is to strengthen injustice. To act, even in the smallest way, is to push the world forward. Change does not wait for perfect conditions. It begins in the inconvenient, the uncomfortable, the unexpected. On that flight, no one boarded with the intention of becoming part of a moral reckoning. They were business travelers, parents, and vacationers. Yet life rarely gives us advance notice of the moments that matter. Change is born in the interruptions, the sudden cracks in the ordinary where truth demands attention. Each passenger had a choice. They could bury the discomfort and carry on as though nothing had happened, or they could allow the moment to awaken their responsibility. Some spoke softly at first. Others joined. Eventually, a collective awareness emerged the moment was bigger than them, bigger than their plans, bigger than the inconvenience of delay. Awareness transformed the cabin from a space of silent observation into a stage for conscience. Moments also teach us that change does not require everyone to act, but it does require someone. The first voice to break the silence matters. The first person to lean forward, to question, to object. These are the sparks. They are often unsure, sometimes trembling, but they create space for others to gather courage. Before long, the spark becomes a flame. The flame becomes impossible to ignore. This is why every moment of injustice carries within it the possibility of transformation. It is never just about the act itself, but about the response it provokes. A denial of dignity can become a catalyst for unity. A humiliation can become the ground on which people stand taller. A pause in silence can become the opening for courage to speak. Change begins not in grand speeches or sweeping declarations, but in the split seconds where ordinary people decide that the present cannot go unchallenged. The passengers on that flight may not have thought of themselves as changemakers, but they were part of something larger than themselves. In their discomfort, in their whispers, in their questions, they discovered what history has always taught: moments carry power. The smallest disruption to routine can expose the deepest truths about justice, fairness, and humanity. There is a unique and often underestimated strength in the role of the witness. History remembers the leaders who spoke, the marchers who walked, the activists who organized. But behind every act of defiance stands a circle of witnesses whose presence gives it meaning. To witness is not passive, it is to hold a mirror to truth, to acknowledge what is happening, to deny injustice the comfort of invisibility. On that plane, dozens of passengers became witnesses to a moment that tested not just one man's dignity, but the collective conscience of everyone present. They did not orchestrate the humiliation. They did not set the rules. But once the denial occurred, they could not pretend not to see. Their eyes, their silence, their eventual voices, all became part of the story. To witness injustice is to be given a choice, to remain neutral or to accept the responsibility that comes with seeing. The power of witness has always shaped the trajectory of justice. When the world saw the images of children in Birmingham being attacked by fire hoses, it was the witness of those photographs that moved hearts across the nation. When television cameras captured the march from Selma to Montgomery, it was the power of witness that shifted public opinion and summoned new laws. The suffering was real long before it was broadcast, but it was the act of people watching, acknowledging, and refusing to turn away that transformed private pain into collective urgency. Witnessing demands moral clarity. It forces people to confront not only what is being done to others, but also who they are in the face of it. A witness cannot unsee what has been revealed. They cannot return to ignorance. To watch a wrong and remain silent is to choose a side, even if one never speaks aloud. Neutrality, when faced with injustice, is never neutral. It is an endorsement of the status quo. On that flight, each passenger carried their own internal dialogue. Some looked away, hoping the moment would pass, because acknowledging it meant facing discomfort. Others leaned forward, sensing that silence was complicity. The act of witnessing began as observation, but for many, it became participation. When whispers grew into questions, when questions grew into protest, it was the witnesses who gave voice to justice. The strength of witness is that it transforms individual experience into collective memory. A wrong done in isolation can be forgotten, dismissed as an isolated incident. But when witnessed by many, it becomes harder to deny, harder to erase. Those passengers could later share the story. I was there. I saw it. This is what happened. And in sharing, they carried forward the truth, ensuring that it could not be buried. History teaches us that witnesses often do not realize the weight of their role in the moment. A bystander in Montgomery may not have known they were part of a story that would shape the civil rights movement. A person standing at the Berlin Wall may not have known they were watching the beginning of freedom for millions. Ordinary people, simply being present and attentive, have carried the burden of truth through their witness. They are the eyes that history borrows, the voices that history records. There is also courage in witnessing. It is not easy to look at injustice head-on. It is not easy to admit that something deeply wrong is unfolding in front of you. Human instinct often seeks comfort, avoidance, and turning away from what unsettles. But true witness requires the discipline to see, to acknowledge, to let the discomfort move you. To be a witness is to say, "This is happening, and I cannot pretend otherwise." The power of witness lies in its ability to shift the narrative. An injustice ignored can be dismissed as exaggerated, but when witnessed, it becomes undeniable. On that plane, the CEO's silent perseverance might have remained a private humiliation had there not been eyes to see it and voices to echo it. Witnesses turned solitude into solidarity. Witnesses transformed one man's silent stand into a shared moment of truth. In every era, the question is not whether injustice will occur, but whether there will be witnesses willing to see it for what it is. And in that seeing, they hold more power than they realize. Not the power to erase the wrong in an instant, but the power to ensure that the wrong is known, remembered, and carried forward into the call for change. History is not confined to textbooks or memorials. It does not exist only in monuments of stone or in the faded ink of old documents. History breathes within us. It is carried in our actions, in our decisions, and in the way we respond when confronted with the tests of dignity and justice. Every moment we live is connected to moments that came before us, and within each of us lies the responsibility to honor the struggles that shaped the path we now walk. When a person of color boards a plane, sits at a table, applies for a job, or walks into a boardroom, they are not walking alone. They carry with them the voices of ancestors who labored without recognition, who endured humiliation, who fought for rights long denied. The simple act of sitting in a seat marked first class carries the weight of generations who were told they would never belong in such a place. History is present in these quiet, ordinary moments, reminding us that nothing ordinary about them was freely given. The power of remembering history is not about living in the past, but about understanding that the past lives in us. Every triumph and every injustice that shaped the world before us leaves traces within the society we now inhabit. The courage of Rosa Parks did not end when she stood her ground. It echoes whenever someone refuses to be diminished. The dreams spoken by Dr. King were not sealed away in time. They continue to resound in the aspirations of every child who believes their future has no ceiling. History within us also carries a dual weight: the burden of injustice and the responsibility of perseverance. We cannot inherit the victories of our forebears without also inheriting their unfinished battles. Witness someone being denied their dignity is to see not just a single act of prejudice, but the shadow of centuries of exclusion. To resist that denial is to step into a continuum of courage that stretches backward through time and forward into the future. Ordinary people become extraordinary when they remember this truth. The mother who insists on better schools for her children is Kenos connected who march for the right to learn. The worker who demands fair treatment echoes the voices of those who risked everything to organize for dignity. The voter who refuses to be silenced is linked directly to those who stood in line for hours facing intimidation just for the chance to cast a ballot. Every step forward today is built on the foundation laid by those who walked before. Yet history is not simply an inheritance. It is also a responsibility. To carry history within us is to be accountable for what we do with it. The memory of sacrifice calls us not to complacency but to action. It demands that we use the opportunities we have not simply for personal gain, but for the advancement of justice and equality. When someone is wronged in front of us, we cannot say, "That is not my fight." The fight was passed to us the moment we were given the privilege to live in a world reshaped by those who came before. There is strength in knowing that we are never alone in the struggle. The weight of history can feel heavy, but it is also a source of power. Those who endured the lash, the chain, the silence, and the indignity did not endure in vain. They live in our persistence, in our dignity, in our refusal to be erased. Their strength becomes our strength, their endurance becomes our endurance. To feel history within us is to know that we are part of something greater than ourselves, something that stretches across time. And there is hope in this truth. If history lives within us, then so does the possibility of change. The same spirit that carried people through centuries of oppression carries us forward still. The same fire that lit the paths of justice for generations continues to burn within those who dare to believe in something better. To feel history alive in our bones is to understand that the struggle is never wasted and that every act of dignity becomes part of a larger, unbroken story. In every age, in every society, the progress of humanity has rested not only in the hands of leaders or institutions, but in the choices made by individuals. The responsibility of the individual is both the smallest and the greatest duty we carry. It is small because it begins in the intimate spaces of conscience and daily behavior. Yet it is great because those seemingly small actions ripple outward, shaping the moral character of communities, nations, and history itself. When injustice unfolds before us, the question is not what others will do, but what we will do. The responsibility of the individual is to recognize that silence, too, is a choice. Every time we choose to speak or to remain silent, stand or to look away, we define not only who we are but what we allow the world around us to become. The refusal to act is itself an action, one that grants power to the very wrong we claim to oppose. Transformations throughout history have always depended on individuals who chose responsibility over indifference. It was a lone woman on a bus who chose not to give up her seat, an ordinary choice that shook the foundations of segregation. It was a young student who walked into a school where others said she did not belong, her mere presence a declaration of dignity. It was citizens who cast ballots in the face of intimidation, each vote a testament to the belief that their voices mattered. None of these were acts of governments, they were acts of individuals, ordinary yet extraordinary in their courage. The responsibility of the individual extends beyond moments of crisis. It exists in how we treat each other in everyday life. It exists in how we teach our children, in how we respond to those who are vulnerable, in how we respect the humanity of the people we pass on the street. Change does not only begin in grand gestures, it begins in the quiet decision to choose fairness over convenience, compassion over indifference, dignity over dismissal. To accept personal responsibility is to understand that our actions carry weight. We may never know the full impact of our choices, but that does not absolve us from making them with integrity. A kind word spoken in the face of cruelty may seem small, but it can restore hope to someone who feels invisible. A refusal to laugh at a cruel joke may not seem like much, but it signals to others that dignity is non-negotiable. A single act of courage may not change the world, but it can change the world for one person. Responsibility also means recognizing the privileges we carry and using them not as shields for comfort, but as tools for justice. Those who have platforms, resources, or influence are called to use them in service of truth, not to retreat into silence. But responsibility is not reserved only for the powerful, it belongs to all of us. A child who stands up to a bully carries responsibility just as much as a CEO who challenges systemic discrimination. The scale may differ, but the principle remains the same. There is also a responsibility to remember that individual action is contagious. Courage inspires courage. Integrity awakens integrity. When one person speaks out, it grants permission for others to do the same. What begins as a lone voice can swell into a chorus that cannot be ignored. Responsibility does not isolate us, it connects us, because every act of conscience reminds others of their own. The challenge of responsibility is that it often comes with cost. To act with integrity may mean losing comfort, risking criticism, or standing apart from the crowd. But responsibility asks us to measure ourselves not by ease, but by principle. The true test of responsibility is not whether we act when it is popular, but whether we act when it is difficult. Responsibility is both burden and gift. It is the burden of knowing that our inaction can perpetuate harm. It is also the gift of knowing that our actions can create hope. It places upon each of us a duty to step forward, not because we must change the entire world alone, but because we cannot ignore the part of the world that lies before us. Hope has always been the unseen force guiding humanity through its darkest storms. It is not fragile optimism, nor is it the denial of struggle. Hope is the compass that points us forward when the road is unclear, when despair tempts us to surrender, when the weight of injustice presses heavy upon our shoulders. It is the belief, stubborn and unshakable, that tomorrow can hold more light than today. History is filled with moments when hope was the only tool left to those who were stripped of everything else. Hope carried enslaved men and women as they whispered songs of freedom under the stars. Hope drove marchers across bridges where hatred met them with batons and tear gas. Hope sustained children walking into classrooms where every glance told them they did not belong. Hope is not weak. It is the strongest weapon ever wielded by the human spirit. When we speak of hope as our compass, we recognize that it does not erase struggle. It gives direction within it. A compass does not make the path easy, but it shows us where to go. Hope directs us not toward comfort, but toward progress. It does not promise the absence of storms, but it promises that the storms are not the end of the journey. With hope as our guide, we can move forward even when the terrain is difficult and the destination unseen. Hope has the power to transform the way we see ourselves and others. It allows us to look at a child in poverty and see not just limitation but limitless potential. It allows us to look at a fractured community and see the possibility of reconciliation. It allows us to look at our own failings and see the chance for redemption. Hope is not passive wishing. It is active vision, the ability to see beyond what is into what can be. But hope must also be nurtured. It cannot survive in cynicism, nor can it grow in complacency. Hope is watered by action. It lives when we teach, when we build, when we forgive, when we risk. To believe in hope is to commit to the work that makes hope real. Dreams alone do not feed the hungry or heal the broken, but hope gives us the courage to do the work that does. It fuels perseverance when results are not immediate, and it sustains us when progress feels unbearably slow. Hope as our compass reminds us that setbacks are not the same as defeat. Every generation has faced moments when despair seemed justified, when progress appeared to stall, when darkness overshadowed light. Yet every generation also discovered that even the smallest acts of hope could reignite possibility. A letter written in prison became a manifesto for justice. A candle carried in a vigil became a movement for peace. A refusal to give in to fear became the birth of freedom. Hope does not need certainty to exist. It only requires the courage to believe. There is a profound responsibility in carrying hope. To live with hope is to refuse to surrender to bitterness. To share hope is to remind others that they are not alone. Hope spreads quietly but powerfully, like fire passed from one torch to another, illuminating the path for all. It demands that we see beyond ourselves, that we believe not only in our own future, but in the future of others. Hope binds us together in a shared belief that no struggle is permanent, no injustice unshakable, no barrier insurmountable. Above all, hope insists that humanity is capable of more than its worst moments. It insists that dignity can rise from humiliation, that unity can grow from division, that justice can emerge from struggle. Hope is not naivety. It knows the cost of progress, but it also knows that the cost of despair is far greater. With hope as our compass, we find direction even when the map is unclear. What happened that day was more than a denial of a seat on an airplane. It was a reminder that dignity, though challenge, can never be stripped away when carried with strength. It was proof that even in moments of humiliation, courage can be found not in anger, but in composure. It was a revelation that injustice, when witnessed, awakens conscience. Conscience, when shared, becomes collective power. The chaos that followed was not disorder, but transformation. It was the sound of ordinary people discovering extraordinary courage, passengers rising together not out of convenience, but out of principle. It was unity in action, a declaration that silence would not be their legacy. For every voice that spoke, for every stand that was taken, a ripple of justice moved through that cabin and beyond it, echoing the truth that history is not only made in grand halls of power, but in the choices of individuals, in the most ordinary of places. This story is not just about one man denied a seat. It is about all of us being called to take a seat in the larger work of justice. It is about perseverance in the face of indignity, about refusing to let the weight of prejudice bend the arc of our journey. It is about the responsibility each of us bears, not to wait for others to act, but to recognize that our actions, however small, can alter the course of events. And above all, it is about hope. Hope is a compass that never loses its direction, even in storms. Hope that reminds us the future is not written by those who deny, but by those who dare to believe. Hope whispers to each of us that, while injustice may persist, so too does the power of unity, the strength of resilience, the promise of change. So let this story remind us the measure of progress is not only in the victories won, but in the courage to continue forward. The strength of a people lies not only in their leaders, but in their willingness to rise together when dignity is tested. And the future belongs not to those who sow division, but to those who believe, even in the face of darkness, that the light will prevail.